When my wife arrived, I stared at her in silence for a moment too long. The kind of silence that burns inside, that fills every space with questions that shouldn't exist in a marriage. And then I asked, in a low, almost powerless voice, but filled with everything I had inside, "Do you love him or me?" She frowned, disconcerted, as if the question were a mistake, as if the absurdity was in my mouth, not in her actions. "Who?" she replied. I simply said, "Albert." And in that instant, time stopped. She froze. Her face went pale, her eyes still, as if the blood had stopped flowing inside her. The lie fell there, silently, but crushing everything. I didn't need anything else. I grabbed my suitcase, left the key on the table. She tried to say something, murmured a lament that sounded more like a belated confession. "You weren't supposed to know like that." But it was too late. For days, weeks, maybe months, I tried to understand where I'd lost my footing. Because, for a long time, she was my world. Not for lack of options, not because of dependence, but because there was something about her that made me want to be a better man every day. I wasn't a perfect husband, of course not. But I loved with a rare loyalty. With presence. With truth. I was always there, even when life got tough, even when love seemed to become routine. I was. And perhaps that was my biggest mistake, trusting that being there would be enough to keep her. But the truth is, some people can't handle the calm of a secure love. They get used to being cared for and, therefore, begin to crave chaos. And when chaos has a name, a face, and the bitter charm of prohibition, some people simply jump. Even if the leap costs everything. She fell. She fell for the illusion of a man who promised nothing, but who, even so, she believed he could deliver everything. She surrendered herself to him little by little, like someone testing the temperature of a river before diving in. An innocent flirtation, a longer conversation, an exchange of glances, until one day, she crossed the line. I don't know exactly when, and maybe it doesn't even matter anymore. What matters is that, the day she came home and I asked that question, everything had already been destroyed. She was no longer mine, and I could no longer be hers after that. I remember how she reacted when she realized I knew. It wasn't regret. Not at that moment. It was fear. Fear of losing what she had, but not out of love, out of security. Because she knew that with me she had someone who would wipe her tears without asking why, someone who would wait for her to fall asleep to cover her with a blanket, someone who would share the last slice of pizza even though she desperately wanted to eat it. And perhaps that was what hurt me the most, realizing that, even with all that, she chose someone who only offered the taste of the forbidden. I left without screaming. Without making a fuss. I left with my soul in pieces, but with my dignity intact. The days that followed were silent. A pain that needed no sound to make itself felt. It hurt to open the cabinets and see the empty spaces. It hurt to pass by the coffee shop where we had coffee on Sundays. It hurt even more when mutual friends started disappearing, because no one knows how to deal with someone who's been betrayed. It's as if the betrayed became an uncomfortable reminder that no one is safe. But still, I carried on. One day after another, I rebuilt myself. Slowly. I reconnected with pieces of myself that had been forgotten. I discovered that I wasn't just the betrayed husband. I was someone who still had a lot to live for. And then, when I least expected it, I met someone. Someone who didn't spark fire, but ignited peace. Who didn't bring butterflies to my stomach, but stability to my chest. Someone who looked into my eyes and didn't seek secrets, but reflected truth. And it was then that fate decided to play with irony. Because it was precisely when I was whole again that the past reappeared. She. Alone. Her face scarred by time, and her eyes filled with unanswered questions. She didn't need to say anything, but she did. I'm sorry. I listened. And I forgave. Not to go back. But to free what still bound me to her. And in that moment, I realized, she had understood what she'd lost. Not because of the man I was, but because of the man she would never have again. And it was there, in that silent moment, that the story truly ended. She tried to rebuild herself. She tried to rediscover the taste of stability. But nothing was the same. Because the love she lost wasn't made of euphoria, it was made of presence. Of comfortable silence. Of hands that found each other in the dark. And when she realized this, it was too late. He, the other, never promised love. Never promised a future. And yet she gambled everything. And lost. She didn't lose a man. She lost the only version of herself that was loved effortlessly, without masks. She lost true love. And she was left with the memory of a love that could have lasted a lifetime, if she hadn't thrown it all away for a momentary desire. Now, she lives with the weight of what she destroyed. With the lightness of having left behind what made me bleed. She carries on, trying to pick up the pieces of a life she herself shattered. And I, at peace, building mine with someone who knows the value of being together even when the outside world calls. But the most surprising thing of all wasn't that she cheated on me. It was what she confessed to me the day we met again, years later, under a light rain that seemed to wash away the past. The words she spoke changed everything I thought I knew about our story. And that's where everything becomes more complicated than it seems. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the feelings, the losses, and the consequences are based on the reality of many lives destroyed by wrong choices. Our objective is clear, to show that cheating is expensive, and that true love, once lost, rarely returns. Get ready now for an intense, shocking, and deeply emotional story. Take a deep breath. The truth is about to hurt. They met on an ordinary afternoon, one of those that promises nothing more than routine, but for some unseen reason, becomes a turning point. He was with a friend, waiting for a coffee that was taking longer than it should have, and she walked in alone, earbuds in, eyes glued to a cell phone screen. Their first exchange of glances was brief, almost unnoticed, but he saw her. She, not immediately. It was as if the whole world was distracted, except him. Time passed, and by some coincidence of those that seemed contrived by fate, they ended up sitting next to each other in line at the counter when the place filled up. She took out one of her earbuds and commented on the slow service. He laughed. And the conversation began there, effortlessly, as if they had reconnected after a long absence, even though they had never seen each other before. Her name was Helena. She had a beauty that didn't scream, but lingered. Her brown eyes held something hard to name, perhaps a mixture of firmness and tenderness that was easily disarming. His name, however, was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who didn't catch your eye at first glance, but left a mark over time. He had a calm demeanor, a deep voice that gave the impression of security, and a gaze that listened even in silence. After their first coffee, other encounters followed. Walks in the park, unpretentious dinners, afternoons of long conversations that began with banalities and ended in confessions neither of them knew they were ready to make. There was no explosion, there was no euphoria. What blossomed between them was a kind of peace. A silent connection that needed no explanation. Over time, everything fell into place. Their worlds began to blend naturally. Helena was a literature teacher, passionate about stories that delve into the depths of humanity. She had a certain restrained romanticism, like someone who believes in love but fears giving in completely. Daniel, on the other hand, was an architect, organized, methodical, but with a sensitive aesthetic sense. He was detail-oriented, careful with the little things, and perhaps that was what won Helena over. The way he remembered details, how he paid attention to her tastes, the pauses in her sentences, her involuntary gestures. She, on the other hand, offered him what he didn't even know he needed, lightness. The ability to look at ordinary days and see beauty in them. The relationship evolved slowly but surely. There was no rush, but there was clarity. When they decided to move in together, it was almost a natural step, without any big speeches or doubts. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, with large windows and natural light streaming in the mornings. It was the kind of place that felt small when it was filled with love. Every corner was decorated little by little, with her books, plants he brought from the garden center, paintings they'd chosen together at local art fairs. Weekends were filled with breakfast on the porch, old movies on Saturday nights, and lazy walks on Sunday afternoons. It was a serene love, yet full of presence. Friends always said they had a rare connection. "You understand each other just by looking at each other," one of Helena's friends would say. And indeed, there was a silent connection between them. At parties, it was common to see them exchanging smiles from a distance, as if sharing secrets amidst the crowd. But like any real relationship, it wasn't perfect. They had their friction. She was more impulsive, sometimes letting her emotions get the better of her. He was reserved, sometimes cold in arguments. But they never went to bed fighting. It was almost an unspoken rule: resolve things before the silence of the night. And they always did. Until they started not resolving them anymore. There was a period when life took more than it offered. Problems at work, a worn-out routine, accumulated fatigue. Conversations began to lose depth. Kisses were no longer as frequent. There were no fights, but there was also no longer that constant vibe of before. It was as if they had entered a lukewarm phase, where everything was still standing, but the colors had faded. Helena started hanging out more with her coworkers, resumed dance lessons, and resumed some personal projects. Daniel, for his part, immersed himself even more in work, spending hours in front of the computer, often staying up all night finishing projects. Their schedules no longer coincided as before. Meals together became rarer. The bed became increasingly silent. But even so, there was affection. Affection still existed in small gestures. A note stuck on the fridge, a "how are you," in the middle of the day, a quick hug before leaving. Helena missed something she couldn't quite pinpoint. Daniel noticed something had changed, but preferred not to name it. Maybe he thought it was just a phase. Maybe he was afraid to face the fact that what was once light was now heavy. Still, they tried. They planned a trip together, something they could do to rekindle their connection. They chose a secluded spot, nature, tranquility. They spent good days. They laughed, cooked together, made love like they hadn't in a long time. And for a moment, it seemed like everything would go back to the way it was before. But, like every desperate attempt to fix something that's already cracked inside, the effect was short-lived. When they returned, the silence returned as well. The apartment seemed emptier, as if something had remained from that trip. Daniel noticed she was more distant. More pensive. He began to notice the lingering glances at her phone, the messages answered more quickly than usual, the smiles that didn't come from him. But he preferred to believe it was fatigue. That it was routine. That their love was strong enough to weather any storm. And maybe it was. If they were both trying equally hard. But something had changed. Something he couldn't yet name, but which was already making itself felt in every absent touch, every hurried kiss, every excuse to avoid a deeper conversation. Still, he remained there. Taking care of her in every detail. Picking up the wet towel from the floor, making her coffee just the way she liked it, putting on the series she watched even though she didn't particularly enjoy it. Helena, for her part, seemed torn. Sometimes she hugged him tighter, as if trying to hold something slipping. Other times, she barely said goodnight. It was an emotional back and forth that confused and hurt, but which he endured with a patience only those who truly love can possess. And perhaps this silent love was his greatest strength, and his greatest weakness. Because, in the absence of explosions, in the absence of big fights or shouting, what there was a man trying to hold together a love that was already shattered. And a woman who, even surrounded by affection, lost herself in silences that hid choices he still didn't know about. Time passed, and with it came moments that should have been simple, but became charged with tension. Family lunches with forced smiles, birthdays with gifts exchanged more out of obligation than desire, nights sleeping in the same bed, but in different universes. There was still no open betrayal, no confrontation, no confession. But a chasm was growing between them. A chasm made of absence, of unspoken words, of eyes that avoided meeting. And Daniel, even without knowing exactly what was wrong, felt something was being lost. Something essential. Something that, if it were to disappear completely, he would never be able to recover. But what he didn't know was that the choice had already been made. That the line had already been crossed. That he was fighting alone for a love that, even though still present on paper, no longer existed on the other side of the bed. And so, between silent dinners, increasingly scarce touches, and a love that seemed to survive only through the memory of what once was, their story was heading toward a breaking point. A point of no return. But Daniel still believed. Still hoped. Still fought. Because when you truly love, you resist until the last thread. Even if that thread was cut long ago, by someone who, while receiving the calmest and most sincere love, sought excitement elsewhere. Daniel began to notice the changes gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a crack growing silently in a wall that had always seemed solid. First, the delays became frequent, then the inattentively answered messages, the hugs that once came spontaneously now needed to be provoked, the kisses given with open eyes, without commitment. Helena seemed to be somewhere else even when she was beside him. She would come home later, always with plausible excuses, always with that tone of weariness in her voice that prevented deeper questions. When he tried to talk, she would gently deflect the subject, saying it was just her head, that everything was fine, and smile an empty smile that no longer reached her eyes. Daniel didn't want to be intrusive, didn't want to be the kind of man who constantly controlled or questioned, so he backed off, respected it, but felt it. He felt the absence where there had once been warmth. I felt I was missing something I couldn't yet name. As the weeks passed, Helena began to take better care of herself. She started wearing perfumes that had long been forgotten on the shelf again, and she started dressing up even for simple appointments, like going to the grocery store or a team meeting. Daniel noticed, complimented her, and tried to get closer through these gestures, but she just smiled and thanked him, as if his compliments no longer meant much. She started receiving more texts during dinner, sometimes leaving the table to answer them. She said it was work, that they were reorganizing the school schedule, that there was a demanding new coordinator. It all made sense, it all sounded convincing. But there was something in her eyes, in the way she hid her phone, that said otherwise. A constant unease began to grow within Daniel, a feeling he fought against every day because he didn't want to become a suspicious man. But intuition sometimes speaks louder than any rational discourse. And no matter how hard he tried to silence that inner voice, it screamed every time Helena said she needed to stay late, or that she had to go to bed early because she was exhausted. He tried to salvage what they had. He planned a dinner, bought her favorite wine, and cooked the dish he'd learned just because of her. Helena arrived late that night, with tired eyes and a hurried smile. He tried to cheer her up, complimenting her on her effort, but he didn't give in. During dinner, he glanced at his watch almost imperceptibly. When he mentioned plans for a short trip during the holiday, she looked away, saying she might not be able to. The excuse was ready, a new project, something he needed to prepare with dedication. Daniel just nodded. He no longer had the strength to insist. The frustration wasn't about losing the woman he loved, but about realizing she didn't even seem to be fighting to stay. He began to observe her more closely. Not as someone watching, but as someone trying to understand where he'd gone astray. He mentally reviewed recent moments, trying to pinpoint the exact point where everything began to slip. It was like searching a house after an earthquake, trying to figure out which wall gave way first. He noticed that she avoided physical contact, that she refused caresses with gentle but constant excuses. That she laughed more at text messages than at his jokes. And, above all, he realized that she was happy, just not with him. And that, more than anything, hurt. Her happiness no longer included him. One night, seeing Helena rushing off to a team meeting, Daniel felt an urge he couldn't contain. He grabbed his keys, waited a few minutes, and left the house. He didn't know exactly what he would do, he had no plan. But the discomfort was too great to ignore any longer. He drove through the streets aimlessly, just trying to follow some intuition. And it was when he stopped at an intersection, with the red light illuminating the interior of the car, that he saw something that chilled his blood. Across the street, Helena was with a man. It wasn't just a conversation. It was the kind of closeness one doesn't have with colleagues. The touch on the waist, the smile on her lips, the intense gaze. She held his hand as if holding something precious. And for a second, Daniel wished he hadn't seen it. He returned home in silence. He didn't confront her. He didn't text her. He sat on the couch for hours, staring into the darkness, trying to understand how someone who sleeps beside him every night could be so distant at the same time. He didn't sleep that night. Helena returned late, entered the house barefoot to avoid making noise, and went straight to the shower. When she came out, she found Daniel awake. He simply said he couldn't sleep. She nodded, said it had been a long day, and lay down without offering any room for conversation. And there they were, lying in the same bed, but in such opposite worlds that any attempt at getting closer felt like an invasion. In the following days, Daniel continued observing. Now, without illusions. The absences made more sense, the excuses, the changes in behavior. Everything fit together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. But he still wasn't sure. He had no proof. Only assumptions. Until, one rainy afternoon, he decided to take her phone. Not out of idle suspicion, but because the silence on the other side of the bed had already said everything that needed to be said. He found messages, photos, precisely scheduled meetings. Affectionate words, declarations hidden in archived conversations. And then he knew. He knew with the pain of someone who never wanted to know. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was daily. Constant. Intense. It was a new life built on the outside while he naively tried to restore the rubble of what was left between them. When she arrived that night, she found Daniel sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes downcast and his hands trembling. He didn't scream, didn't cry. He just asked, his voice cracking, "Do you love him, or me?" She froze. She fell silent. She pretended not to understand. "Who?" she whispered. And Daniel, with a weariness that seemed to come from a place much deeper than his body, answered, "Albert." And it was at that moment that time stood still. The name had a weight that tore through the air. Her body stiffened, her eyes fixed on nothing. It was no longer possible to hide. And Daniel knew. He knew there was no way back. The suitcase was already packed. Not because he had known in advance, but because his instinct knew. The key was left on the table. She tried to say something. A formless lament, "You weren't supposed to know like this." But none of that mattered anymore. Silence fell between them, sharp, absolute. He left. And the moment the door closed, what they had died forever. But what he still didn't know, was what had motivated it all. The betrayal was already an exposed wound. But what lay behind it still had the power to sink everything even further. And this revelation was about to change not only the pain, but his understanding of everything he believed he had experienced with her. The following weeks passed like a dense fog over Daniel's life. He couldn't remember the exact days or hours. He only felt the weight of a silence that now resided within him. Helena was no longer in his home, in his routine, or in his life. Her scent on the pillows was gone, nor were her smiles crossing the hallways. Only absence remained. And absence had a smell, a color, a sound. It was the sound of the key no longer turning in the door, the corner of the wardrobe that became more spacious, the two plates that became one again. But what hurt most wasn't the loneliness, it was the memory. Because true love isn't extinguished by disappointment, it rots. And rotting from within is a slow and cruel process, where everything that was beautiful begins to stink over time. Daniel tried to start over. He created new habits. He rearranged the furniture. He got a haircut. He joined the gym. He started reading before bed, just to avoid the company of his thoughts. Sometimes it worked. Other times, it didn't. Helena's face would pop into his mind unexpectedly. When he heard an old song, when he passed a street they used to walk hand in hand, or when he saw a couple laughing idly on a park bench. It was hard to accept that all that had been exchanged. And worse, for a man who wasn't even part of the life they'd built. Daniel wondered if she'd ever truly loved him or if it was all just a well-told lie. But he knew better. He knew there had been love. He just couldn't understand why it hadn't been enough. And that was precisely what tortured him the most. Until one day, months later, an email arrived. Helena. The name appeared on the screen, and for a second, Daniel considered deleting it without reading it. But something made him click. It was a short message. She asked to talk. She said she didn't want to get back together, didn't want to confuse things, but that she needed to say something. For me, she wrote. For you. He thought, took a deep breath, and replied with only a time and a neutral place. A park between his old house and the new neighborhood he'd moved to. It was early autumn, and the dry leaves on the ground made a soft crunch under his feet as he walked toward the designated bench. Helena was already there. Alone. Different. Her face thinner, her eyes deeper. She carried an expression Daniel couldn't name, but it carried a weight that seemed far greater than simple regret. She stood up when she saw him, as if respect still lingered there, even amidst the rubble. He sat calmly. He didn't smile. He didn't extend his hand. He just waited. She took a deep breath, tucked her hair behind her ear, and began speaking. Bluntly. Without excuses. As if she'd rehearsed every word 100 times. I was wrong, Daniel. I was wrong with you, I was wrong with myself. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. I thought I was searching for something I was missing, but today I understand that what I was missing was within me, not outside. And worst of all, I didn't come to you just to tell you this. There's something you don't know. Something that might change how you feel about me, or maybe just confirm that I didn't deserve what you gave me. Daniel stared at her, saying nothing. The muscles in his face were tense. Helena continued, more hesitant now, as if she were about to step into a minefield. When it all started between me and him, it wasn't out of love, nor desire. It was out of impulse. Out of vanity. Out of curiosity. But there was one thing you don't know. He never liked me. He never truly wanted me. He never chose me. He used me, Daniel. From the beginning. Daniel narrowed his eyes in confusion, but remained silent. Her voice was shaking now, and the words came like short stabs. Do you remember that friend of yours, Gustavo, who you met in college? The one who disappeared after a silly disagreement. He and Albert have known each other. They've worked together for years. I didn't know that at first, I only found out later, when I was already involved. They made a bet, Daniel. It was a bet. She paused, waiting for his reaction. Daniel didn't move. His heart was pounding too hard for him to feel anything else in his body. Helena continued, swallowing hard. They were at a bar. I walked by alone after a school event. Albert recognized me from a photo of you Gustavo had shown him. The plan was simple, make me cheat on you. Simple as that. Seduce me. Take me away from you. Make me fall. And he succeeded. I was stupid. I was blind. I let myself be carried away. I felt desired, alive. But it was all a lie. I was a joke, Daniel. She was crying now. Not with drama, but with a low, heavy cry that came from deep within. Daniel's mouth felt dry. His thoughts were jumbled. His stomach churned. A gamble. Everything had been a gamble. Helena had betrayed him, but she had also been betrayed. By another. By everyone. Even by herself. The pain he felt now was different. It was no longer just the pain of abandonment, of loss, of disappointment. It was the pain of knowing everything had been manipulated. That the woman he loved had been used as an instrument for a wounded ego. That years of trust and sharing had been destroyed by a dirty game between two immature men and a woman in crisis. When I found out, it was too late. He confessed to me, laughing. He said he'd won 200 reis, a bottle of whiskey, and an expensive dinner. He said you always seemed like the kind of man who would never know, and that you only did it because you thought it was funny. I wanted to die then. And yet. I didn't look for you before. Because I knew none of this would erase what I did. I chose. Even if I was used, I chose. And I lost you. And I deserved it. Daniel lowered his head. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. The pain was dry now, like ashes from an old fire. Everything made sense. Albert's disdain. Gustavo's estrangement. The haste with which everything fell apart. He was betrayed by the one who shared his bed. But he was also betrayed by the one who shared his story. His trust. His life. And as much as the truth hurt, it finally set him free. He understood he couldn't have avoided it. That it wasn't his fault. That loving with purity was never the mistake. Helena tried to continue, but her voice faltered. I needed you to know. Not to wash away my guilt. But so you know it wasn't about you. It was never about your mistake. It was about my cowardice. About my weakness. You deserved more. And now you have more. And I only have silence. Daniel stood. He stood for a moment without saying a word. Helena didn't move. He looked at her, one last time. Not with hate. Not with anger. But with a definitive goodbye. The kind of look that ends an entire cycle. And he left. With firm steps, unhurried. Like someone who carries truth in their pocket and dignity in their heart. And in that moment, Helena knew. That she had lost everything. Not because of betrayal. But because of choice. And that the weight of regret would now be her only companion. Daniel walked for several blocks after leaving Helena sitting on the park bench, without looking back. The sky was beginning to darken, and the wind dragged dry leaves across the sidewalks as if the world wanted to wipe away the traces of that conversation. His steps were firm, but his heart seemed out of sync. There were no more tears, no more screams. There was a deep silence inside him, the kind of silence that sets in not when pain screams, but when it has consumed everything it can. He walked to the nearest subway station, entered the crowded car, ignoring the jostling of people, and lost himself in the muffled noise of the tracks, trying to organize his thoughts. Inside, he was no longer the same. Not after that truth. What Helena had said changed the way he viewed the entire past, not just the ending. The betrayal that had previously seemed selfish and impulsive now took on the contours of humiliation and manipulation. She had been the target of a bet. A plaything used by another man, a man who, ironically, had once had her trust. It was too cruel to be real, but the look in her eyes left no doubt. None of it had been staged. The shame in her eyes wasn't performative. It was sincere. And as much as he didn't intend to forgive her, he felt a strange kind of pity. Not for the woman who betrayed him, but for the woman who was deceived while destroying her own world. In the following days, Daniel immersed himself in his routine with almost mechanical discipline. He arrived at work early, left late, and barely spoke to his colleagues. He ignored Helena's messages, which reappeared, now spaced out, almost always silent, as if she simply needed to know he was still reading. But he didn't respond. There was nothing left to respond to. What existed between them was buried. But even buried, it still left a bitter taste he couldn't swallow. It was one Saturday afternoon, while visiting an art exhibition with a friend, that life decided to show him that there is no pain that cannot, in time, make way for something new. On the second floor of the museum, while observing a melancholic painting of a woman sitting in an empty field, Daniel heard a soft voice nearby comment on the painting's light. He reflexively turned his head and found a pair of attentive eyes, a discreet smile, and an air of someone who knew how to read silence. Her name was Laura. She was a photographer, and her calmness contrasted with the chaos still living within him. They talked right there, between rooms, and then had coffee in the museum garden. It was a simple conversation. But there was a fluidity between them that made Daniel unaware of the hours passing. For the first time in a long time, he genuinely laughed. Laura didn't ask about the past, didn't probe open wounds. She spoke softly, yet deeply. She was perceptive, intelligent, but without needing to prove anything. Daniel felt seen. And, more than that, he felt he could be himself, with all the cracks still exposed. They went out again. Gradually, unhurriedly. And he realized something different was growing there. It wasn't the kind of love that comes with urgency, but the kind that plants roots slowly, firmly, away from the storms. It was a love that didn't demand immediate healing, but offered shelter. And that was enough. Meanwhile, Helena faced the consequences of each choice. Albert disappeared from her life a few days after the revelation. He stopped responding to messages, changed his number, and blocked her on social media. The last contact was a dry call in which he simply said that the deal was paid, and that there was no point in staying in touch. Helena didn't insist. She cried alone that night and many others. Her reputation among her co-workers began to crumble when, unintentionally, a teacher mentioned seeing Albert with another woman, his wife. Because, yes, he was married. And she only found out later. Little by little, people began to distance themselves. Not because they knew everything, but because she was no longer the same. She was bitter, absent, disconnected. She tried to reconnect with her old friendships, but realized that much had been lost along the way. Including her own identity. She sent Daniel one last message weeks after their encounter in the park. A brief, almost silent request, saying she'd left an envelope for him with a friend and didn't expect a reply, just that he'd agree to read it. Daniel considered ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of him. He found the envelope in a bookstore near their home. It was a letter. Handwritten. The handwriting was firm, but the words trembled. She said she didn't know where her dignity lay, that perhaps she had lost it on the nights she chose to live a lie. She told how she woke up with a tight chest every day, how she dreamed of him silently holding her hand. How she watched old videos on her phone just to hear his laughter. She said she tried to move on, that she tried to convince herself she did the right thing by seeking something new, but that time had shown her that new doesn't mean better. She confessed that she saw Daniel as a rare man, and that now she understood she hadn't lost a relationship. She had lost her only chance at a home within someone. She said forgiveness wasn't his obligation, but that she needed, on her own, to apologize one last time. And that she hoped, from the bottom of her soul, that he would find the peace she herself had destroyed. Daniel read the letter and sat still for a long time. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He simply understood that her pain was real. But it was no longer his responsibility to heal what she had broken. He put the letter in a drawer along with other papers that represented closed parts of his story. And that same weekend, he took Lara to a place he always liked to visit when he wanted to think, a lookout point high up in the city, where the sunset seemed to wash over the world. They sat side by side. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they were silent for several minutes. It was a light silence. Different. It was the kind of silence that doesn't weigh down, but comforts. And Daniel, there, knew. I knew I was starting over. That love was still possible. That pain didn't define him. That the past could hurt, but it no longer needed to be controlled. Helen moved on with her life. She went to therapy. She changed schools. She moved cities. She tried to reinvent herself. He found some stability, but he couldn't fill the void. Time had cruelly taught her that what is lost through pride, impulse, or vanity, cannot be recovered. She never found anyone like Daniel again. She didn't even look for him, deep down. Because she knew there was only one. And he was no longer hers. And so, the past remained where it belonged. Helena continued with her regret. Daniel, with the peace of having forgiven, not to forget, but to free himself. And, above all, with the certainty that those who offer calm, true, and complete love, do not deserve to be betrayed, but deserve to be loved by someone who knows how to hold that love with both hands. Without letting go. Without letting go. Daniel began to carry with him a strange sensation, as if he had lived through an earthquake and was now walking on ruins that were slowly being rebuilt with greater calm and awareness. Nothing he felt was easy to translate. After the letter, after the full revelation, after seeing Helena crumble before the truth she herself had brought, the peace he had achieved was not tainted by anger, but by a kind of bitter lucidity. The clarity that love, even the most genuine, is not enough when reciprocity is lacking. What is built with care can be destroyed in seconds by those who do not know the value of what they hold in their hands. And, as much as he had learned this through pain, now that pain no longer dominated his daily routine. It existed only as a scar, no longer as an open wound. He began to see the past with an uncomfortable clarity. The details of scenes he'd previously considered small, everyday moments now took on new meaning. He perceived more deeply the signs, the omissions, the pauses in Helena's gestures that he'd interpreted as fatigue, but which were, in fact, hesitation. It was hard to face the fact that his love had endured while she was already drifting apart inside. But there was nothing left to fix. There was only the understanding that he'd done the best he could, right up until the very last minute. And that anyone who abandons true love to chase illusions must inevitably live with the absence of what they let slip away. Lara, in turn, entered his life with a gentleness that didn't demand a place, but rather conquered space with a genuine presence. She didn't fill the voids left by Helena, because Daniel knew no one should enter another's life to fill holes, but she offered a new path, built on respect, listening, and patience. They didn't talk much about the past. Lara respected his silences, and in return, he felt comfortable being honest. For the first time, Daniel experienced a relationship without the pressure of constantly proving himself. With her, the days didn't need grand events. All that was needed was the comfort of being with someone who didn't hide, who looked into your eyes and spoke from the heart, without games, without double-dealing, without absence disguised as routine. Still, a dilemma began to grow within him as the months passed. Not regarding Lara, but regarding the idea of forgiveness. Because forgiving isn't just a rational choice, it's a moral decision that shakes everything we've been taught about justice, deservingness, love, and boundaries. Helena's letter had left its mark. She didn't apologize for getting back together, nor did she beg for another chance. But what she had in that last message was sincere pain and the complete exposure of a woman finally acknowledging her fall. Daniel spent days trying to understand his feelings about that. He'd already told himself he'd forgiven, but was that true? Or was it simply a way of not holding a grudge? Doubt haunted him at unexpected moments. When he saw a couple arguing on the street, when he heard a song about second chances, when he sat down for coffee and remembered the way Helena used to stir the sugar in silence, staring into the cup as if trying to predict the future. Why did she do what she did? What, truly, led a woman who had a stable life, a present partner, a peaceful home, to destroy everything for an empty promise? Was it possible to feel true regret and still not deserve a second chance? And, even more so, how far should forgiveness go? Daniel began writing about it in a notebook he kept by his bed. Not with the intention of publishing it or showing it to anyone, but as an attempt to organize his own feelings. One day, he wrote, "I loved her as calmly as I could, but perhaps she was expecting a storm. Now the storm has passed, and what's left is silence. But is her silence the same as mine?" Another night, he wrote, "Forgiveness is an act of courage. But it's also a limit. It's not about forgetting, it's about choosing not to live with anger. But sometimes, forgiveness isn't about healing the other. It's about freeing yourself." This dilemma consumed him subtly but constantly. Until one day, walking with Lara through a used book fair, he saw a familiar figure in the distance. Helena. She was alone, her hair down, her expression lighter, but still with that look of someone carrying something that never goes away. She saw it too. And for a second, she was paralyzed. Lara didn't notice, continuing distractedly to look at the booths. Daniel tried to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen her. But he couldn't. Something inside him pulled him. He went to her. Not with the intention of reopening stories, but perhaps to finally close what was left. Helena greeted him with a restrained smile, her eyes moist but tearless. She said she lived in a more remote neighborhood, taught at a small school, that the pace was calm, and that she had changed a lot, even though no one could see it from the outside. Daniel simply listened. He didn't respond with irony or coldness. Just with presence. When she thanked him, once again, for reading the letter, he nodded. He said he had indeed read it. And that he understood. Helena then leaned in a little closer, as if she didn't want others to hear, and whispered something that would resonate with Daniel for a long time: "You were the only man who saw me whole. And I destroyed that. You don't need to say anything. Just thank you for being true to the end." Daniel didn't answer. He touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of peace, and returned to Lara, who was waiting for him without question. In that instant, something inside him loosened. An old knot. A weight he hadn't even known he still carried. And he felt, finally, that he was free. Life went on, as it should have. Daniel and Lara moved in together months later. Not as a replacement for an old story, but as a natural consequence of a new one that had been built with deep roots. He now looked back with maturity. He knew that what he had experienced with Helena was real to a certain extent. But true love must come from both sides. One alone cannot sustain it. His pain was legitimate, but it no longer needed to define his path. What had once been an open scar was now just a memory. And forgiveness, more than a gift to Helena, had been a gift he had given himself, the gift of moving forward, light, whole, clean. And if there's one thing Daniel learned from all of this, it's that those who leave don't always make the biggest mistake. Sometimes, those who stay are the ones who need the most courage. The courage to start over. To trust again. To love again, even knowing the risk of getting hurt. Because love, when it's true, isn't perfect. But it is sincere. And those who learn to love truly also learn that forgiveness is the final stage of love. Not to rebuild the past, but to prevent it from destroying the future. But before his story with Lara could fully blossom, something still needed to happen. An unexpected reunion. An unplanned gesture. A phrase that would test everything. Because, as much as everything seemed resolved, life still held one final movement, the kind of silent turn that doesn't shatter what's whole, but reveals what has truly been healed. And what still remains, deep down, waiting to be freed. Spring arrived with more ease than Daniel expected. The days seemed longer, not just because of the change in the clock, but because of a kind of calm he began to feel for the first time in a long time. Life with Lara was silent in a healthy way, like a background music that needed no emphasis to be noticed. They understood each other in their looks, in the pauses, in the gestures that required no justification. There were no grandiose promises between them, just constancy. And it was this constancy that Daniel now valued above all else. Having someone who remained, even when the outside world demanded so much, was the true form of love he had learned. Still, like every soul that has ever carried deep pain, there were moments when the past whispered. Not as a threat, but as a reminder of who he had been. A memory that sometimes came in dreams, other times in scents or songs. And although he had overcome everything, some healed wounds still itched on rainy days. One Sunday, Laura suggested they spend the weekend in a nearby town known for its bucolic landscapes and discreet inns. Daniel accepted enthusiastically. He needed that break. Leaving the city behind for a day or two felt more than a rest, it felt like a rite of passage. On the way, they chatted about simple things. Laura enjoyed listening to stories, and Daniel gradually learned to tell them more freely. They laughed together, shared silences that didn't weigh them down, and allowed themselves to be there, completely lost in the moment. Arriving at the inn, the atmosphere was cozy. A wooden cottage surrounded by tall trees, the scent of burning wood in the distance, and a peace that settled in their bones. That night, after a light dinner, they sat on the porch with glasses of wine and bare feet. Laura looked at him tenderly and said she'd never felt so safe with anyone. Daniel simply held her hand firmly. Words sometimes obscured what the eyes said best. The next day, while exploring the historic center, Laura fell in love with an antique shop. Daniel went in with her, curious about the scattered objects. It was a place crammed with forgotten stories, antique clocks, black and white photographs, letters from distant lovers. Between one shelf and another, Daniel found a thick book, bound in worn leather, with handwritten notes on the back cover. He picked it up and began leafing through it without much expectation. The pages spoke of reconciliation, of time, of choices that shape futures. But it was a quote scribbled in the margin that made him pause: "Life gives us chances to fail and to try again, but not always with the same people." He closed the book and was silent for a moment. Laura, noticing the change in his expression, came closer. Daniel smiled and said it was just an old memory that the phrase stirred. She didn't ask anything else. She knew his silence was also part of the story. On the way back to the inn, Daniel drove along the winding road surrounded by trees as a light rain began to fall. And it was in this setting, amid the sound of raindrops on the windshield and the smell of wet earth, that he decided to speak. He said he had forgiven everything, that he had understood every part of the pain he had experienced, but that there was still a question he had never dared to ask: if, deep down, he was also responsible for not seeing what was being lost before his eyes. Laura listened attentively and responded with a maturity that dismantled any defenses. He said that love is not measured only by the effort we make, but also by how we allow ourselves to see the other person. That perhaps he had given so much of himself that he failed to see that the other person no longer wanted to receive. And that the mistake was not loving too much, but believing that love alone would sustain everything. Daniel was silent for a moment, and then said that this was the most honest answer he had ever heard. And, in a way, it was also the one that freed him the most. When they returned to the city, the days passed with ease. Daniel returned to old habits, like writing letters he'd never sent. Not out of attachment, but for clarity. It was like putting down on paper everything his heart no longer needed to carry. One of these letters was addressed to Helena, but it remained in a box he kept locked high in the closet. It was a letter without anger, without resentment. It simply said he forgave her for everything, not because she deserved it, but because he deserved to move on without pain. And that he truly hoped she would find a path to peace. There was no longer love, but there was compassion. Because time had taught him that to hate is also to remain imprisoned. And he had already chosen to be free. One afternoon, as he crossed the street after work, Daniel heard someone calling his name. He turned and found a face he hadn't seen in years: Gustavo. The same Gustavo who had been his college friend, who had mysteriously disappeared without much explanation, and who would later be linked to the betrayal that destroyed his marriage. The reunion was dry. A brief handshake. Gustavo seemed embarrassed. "You said you needed to apologize." That everything that happened with Albert had been stupid, the actions of an immature and clueless man. That you never thought Daniel would find out. That you were driven by frustration, old jealousy, and the desire to provoke someone he thought had everything. Daniel listened in silence. And when Gustavo finished, he simply said that the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the disregard for something he considered friendship. And that too much time had passed for any explanation to make sense. Gustavo nodded, head down. And left. Daniel, for his part, felt lighter than he had imagined. Not because Gustavo deserved forgiveness, but because he himself no longer deserved to carry anyone's grudge. That same week, Lara received a job offer in another state. It was an important opportunity for her career, a long-term photography project, something she'd always dreamed of. When she told Daniel, her expression was torn between excitement and fear. He held her hands firmly and told her she had to go. That her dreams couldn't be postponed for anyone. That he would be there, cheering her on, watching from wherever he was. And she responded with tears in her eyes, saying she didn't want to leave what they were building. But Daniel smiled and said that true love isn't measured by distance, but by the intention to stay, even when their paths temporarily separate. In the days leading up to Lara's trip, they lived intensely. Every breakfast, every walk, every touch. Daniel knew they would miss her, but he also knew they were ready. That they didn't need eternal promises, just the certainty of now. On the day they said goodbye, at the airport, she hugged him tightly and said, "You are the most beautiful home I've ever known." And he replied, with a smile, "And you are the peace I never knew I needed." She left. And he stayed. But for the first time, staying didn't mean loss. It was just another way of loving. That same night, when he got home, Daniel opened the box where he kept the letter to Helena and all the traces of the past. He read every line as if reading it for the last time. And then, without hesitation, he threw everything into a small portable fireplace he kept on the porch. The flames consumed the memories quickly. And he watched in silence, without pain, without guilt. As the last page turned to ash, he took a deep breath. The night was calm. The world was at peace. And his heart, finally, too. The following weeks were marked by a different kind of silence for Daniel, the kind of silence that doesn't oppress, but rather reorganizes what's left, cleanses the corners of the soul, and makes room for the new. Lara's absence from the house was felt, of course, but not devastatingly. It was a longing with purpose, the kind that comes with the certainty that someone is exactly where they should be. There were photos of her scattered around the apartment, small objects she'd left unintentionally, as if her presence was there by choice, even from a distance. Daniel found solace in the routine they'd built together, but also in the maturity of understanding that true love doesn't need control to exist, it simply endures, even when physically out of reach. And while she pursued her photography project in another city, he devoted himself to his own dreams, redirecting his career, accepting invitations to lecture on emotional architecture, a concept he himself began to develop, based on the idea that the spaces we inhabit say a lot about who we are inside. At one of these events, Daniel presented a project he called Living Scars. It proposed renovating abandoned spaces and transforming them into centers for listening and emotional reconstruction. The impact was immediate. He received partnership invitations, praise, and support. But what he didn't expect was the email he received a few days later, with Helena's name as the sender. The message was short, without regrets, without nostalgia. It simply said that she had read about the project and thought it was fair that he use his own pain to create something that would heal others. At the end, she thanked him for showing her, even unintentionally, that true love isn't made of intensity, but of permanence. Daniel read it, took a deep breath, and didn't respond. Not out of coldness. But because some stories, no matter how much they end with understanding, still need to end in silence. Helena's life had taken a different path. She stayed away from her old circles, away from everything that harked back to the past. She moved to another city, changed her hairstyle, and began teaching adult classes in a community project. There, she saw lives being rebuilt and found reflections in the stories of women who had also lost their love through bad choices. She learned, late, that not all regrets can be repaired, and that starting over requires, first and foremost, accepting the consequences of what was destroyed. She no longer attempted contact. She was no longer driven by the hope of reconquest, but by a sincere desire for respect. She had understood that Daniel was on a different path, and that he no longer fit in her. Time had taught her, cruelly but also clearly, that no love survives betrayal when trust is torn out by the roots. And although she carried the weight of having caused this, she finally began to find some form of peace in her own solitude. Laura, on the other hand, was experiencing one of the most intense moments of her career. Her work won awards, her photos graced magazines and exhibitions, and she began receiving international invitations. But between interviews and trips, she never stopped sending Daniel simple messages, sometimes with images of landscapes accompanied by short captions, other times with phrases only they understood. It was a love that didn't require daily confirmation, but was renewed with each small gesture. When she returned, months later, she found Daniel waiting at the same spot where they had said goodbye. There were no flowers, no surprises planned. Just him, with steady eyes and a light smile, as if to say, "I waited, and I would wait again." Laura ran to him and hugged him without saying a word. In that gesture, they sealed what had already been decided: this was where they belonged. Their reunion wasn't a fresh start. It was a continuation. They moved on with the naturalness of those who didn't need promises to stay. They traveled together, renovated the apartment, and built a library with books from both of them, blending tastes, stories, and references. The house now held the essence of both, a perfect blend of a past overcome and a future under construction. Laura never asked about Helena, and Daniel never felt the need to hide. There was no room for ghosts when everything there was made for real. From her, he learned that healthy love isn't imposed, doesn't suffocate, doesn't require constant proof. It simply happens, with respect, with dialogue, with care. And that was enough for him to be certain he had found the right place to love again. Months later, at a university lecture, Daniel was invited to share his personal journey as part of the development of his new project. He spoke without holding anything back. He said he had been betrayed, that he had faced pain that almost made him lose faith in love, but that he decided to use it all as the foundation for something greater. The audience listened in absolute silence. And at the end, when a student raised her hand and asked what he would do if he could go back in time, Daniel smiled and replied with calm firmness, "I would have chosen myself sooner." That sentence reverberated like a dull beat on a drum. Because, deep down, that was what was missing in many love stories: self-love. He understood that loving another is only worthwhile when we don't abandon ourselves in the process. And that was his greatest lesson. Years passed. Helena continued her life discreetly. He didn't remarry, didn't seek intense relationships. He preferred silence. He visited a small bookstore every Saturday, wrote letters he never sent, and kept an old photo of Daniel on his nightstand, not out of longing, but as a living reminder that some mistakes are forever repaid. Sometimes he passed couples on the street and found himself imagining what his life would have been like if he had made different choices. But there was no more pain in his eyes. Only the peaceful emptiness of someone who understands that what they lost will never return. And that some doors, once closed, must remain that way. Daniel and Laura, on the other hand, began working together on social projects aimed at rebuilding families destroyed by disloyalty, abuse, and absence. Their stories began to inspire others. They received letters from people across the country telling how their testimonies had given them the strength to leave toxic relationships or rebuild their faith in love. And this, for him, was one of the greatest meanings of the pain he experienced, transforming suffering into a path for others. Today, when he looks back, Daniel feels neither anger nor regret. Only gratitude. For having survived what seemed unbearable. For having learned that love that hurts isn't love at all, and that those who leave without explanation once wanted to stay. And that those who trade the certain for the uncertain always run the risk of discovering, too late, that the uncertain never intended to stay. Helena moved on with regret. Daniel with the peace of having left what hurt him. And Laura with the certainty that she had found a man who knew how to love even after being destroyed inside. A man who, in being broken, discovered the art of rebuilding himself. If this story touched you in any way, comment below with your thoughts and your thoughts on the paths each character took. We want to know what you learned from this journey. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Here you'll always find real, profound, and thought-provoking stories like this one. Remember, cheating doesn't just destroy relationships, it tears away the emotional foundation of those who truly love, ruins families, erases beautiful stories, and leaves scars that time can't always erase. Before cheating, consider whether it's worth losing what's rare for something you never wanted to keep. The channel does not support any kind of cheating. Our mission is to make it clear that where there is truth, there is room for love. But where there is lies, there are only ruins. Choose to be true. Choose to be whole. Choose not to hurt the one who gave you everything. Because, once destroyed, true love doesn't come back.